Devil's Throat by Robert Eastland. Read by George Sewell.
On the night it happened, the vault of the Highwayman was filled with music, raucous, beery laughter, and a fine blue mist of cigarette smoke. In a lonely corner, though, Larry Sterne sat bleary-eyed and unshaven. He was a broad, heavy man, with a coarse-grained face, powerful hairy wrists, and hands the size of shovels. Everyone gave him a wide berth. Not just that night, but all nights, in fact. Some were sympathetic, of course. Poor, aging Larry Sterne, they'd think. A lost and broken man since his pretty wife, Marilyn, had run off into the night with local ramrod Tommy McFarlane. And all of that on top of his great personal tragedy Larry had suffered during the Falklands War. Poor, dangerous Larry Sterne, too. For one leg or not, he was still a paratrooper at heart. For his own part, Larry had always been philosophical about the stream of golden tracer which had ripped his leg into bloody chunks that lively day on Tumbledown Mountain, and had left him a cripple with a run-down Yorkshire cottage, a measly pension, and a brave but overworked wife. After all, it was the red badge of courage, wasn't it? People could actually see that he had been where the real action was. Other related matters, though, had gradually got to work on Larry. The fact that he'd never really taken to the artificial limb they'd first given him, and had eventually had to resort to an old-fashioned peg leg, that had been a bit of a problem. Oh, mothers would still stop to point him out to their children and call him Larry the war hero, but the novelty had not lasted that long, and it had never really made up for the fact that he'd not only found himself unemployed, but practically unemployable, that he couldn't drive anymore, that he couldn't get up the terraces at Bradford City, and most important of all, that he couldn't show Marilyn much in bed. The doctors had been pretty unsympathetic about it, too. They'd just said he was lucky to be alive, after all. He might as well not be now, he reflected, slumped in the Highwayman vault, drowning his bitterness with yet more strong, dark ale. Larry cursed aloud. The punters at the bar cast nervous glances in his direction and shuffled further away. The landlord at the other side looking at his former good customer with sad but wary eyes. Nobody wanted to remain in Larry's presence these days. Not any longer than they absolutely had to, anyway. They'd all seen the shocking violence he was capable of, even with his wooden leg. Few of them had forgotten the occasion when Larry had assaulted two drunken Irish navvies in the parking lot outside, simply because he'd chanced to overhear one say that Sinn Féin would always get his vote, whatever the volunteers got up to. Larry had seen too many of his old army pals murdered and maimed and pumping out blood on the battle-scarred Belfast streets to let such a comment pass. Yet the insane fury with which he had smashed a beer bottle into one's face, kicked the other's head against the wall with skull-splitting impact, and had generally beaten them both in an unstoppable rage until they were both half dead, had seemed a little severe, and had raised some whispered speculation about where Marilyn Sterne and her lover had really disappeared to. Larry had survived the incident with the Irishman. He'd been found not guilty of GBH partly because of his obvious physical impediment, partly because of the many braids he'd won during his military service, but mainly because the IRA had blown up a West End pub the day before the jury were due to return their verdict. Everyone he knew had turned out to celebrate with him that night, slapping him on the back and buying him drinks. Even then, though, in the midst of his triumph, as the hours had passed and his eyes had misted to that old, familiar, feverish red, they'd begun to edge away from him again, even his best friends, just as they were doing now. "Not yet," he blurted out, rising unsteadily from the pub bench. "Not yet. Gotta get much drunker. Much drunker. Not going yet." And with that, he ordered himself a large Jack Daniels. He blundered back to his seat, his head spinning as he downed the hot, spicy fluid. Nothing seemed to make sense to him anymore. And that was fine. That was just what he wanted. He staggered into an upright position again and toppled towards the vault door. This was one grisly thing he was going to have to go through. and the drunker he was, the better. Christ, but he didn't want to see their faces again, their green, pulped, rotting faces. He'd do anything rather than this. Anything. He had no choice, though. And as he tottered out under the wet, black October sky, the lurid memory of that ghastly night 3 years ago came flooding back to him. It had been dark and wet that night, too. Larry remembered the chill autumn rain spattering on the windscreen of McFarlane's Land Rover, and the muffled cries and wild, vain struggles of the bound, gagged bodies in the back. They'd told him he wouldn't be able to drive again, those military doctors. But Larry had proved them wrong that night. He'd driven all right. How he'd driven. Slewing that vehicle down the rutted cart track that was Blamire's Lane, grinding the gears, crashing over curbs and ripping through the foliage. It had hardly mattered. McFarlane wouldn't be needing his Land Rover again. That bastard! Larry was going to show him that night. He remembered the smell of crushed grass and churned mud as he skidded the vehicle to a halt on the deserted playing fields which had temporarily become a building site. He remembered climbing from the cab, a pick in one hand, a loaded Colt Cobra 45 in the other. It had been dark as silk down there, silent as the grave. Perfect. And all of that because a half-mile stretch of the Shipley to Harrogate Railway had been under repair. How bloody perfect. He'd dragged them from the back of the Land Rover, as naked as he'd found them together, and frog-marched them down between the diesels and the lifting engines, through a broken-down piece of mesh fencing and out into the disrupted railway, and then into the Devil's Throat. The Devil's Throat. That too had been perfect. It was a single railway cutting, a narrow canyon sliced through a mountainous slag heap, over 100 yards long and as black as a colliery tunnel. This was to be the last resting place of Larry's 2 victims. Mercilessly he'd march them in, forcing them along at gunpoint, McFarlane stumbling and pleading, Marilyn silent and stiff, a thing without hope. It was here where Larry had taken a last look at his wife, her flaxen locks plastered down in the rain, her firm brown body trussed up like a chicken and shivering in the cold. It was here where Larry had executed them both, where he placed the nozzle of his Colt Cobra between their eyes and given them a single slug each. The bodies had then been swiftly buried in the silt and gravel on the floor of the Devil's Throat, and Larry had hobbled back to the Land Rover. He'd not left, though, before he'd first marked the spot by chalking a tiny chalk cross on the aging brickwork at the side of the cutting. It had amused him, that had. A cross! Ha! A cross! It was more than treacherous scum like that deserved. Still, it had not been put there for their benefit, but for his. It could only be sensible to make sure that he at least knew where the evidence lay. Within the week, the Shipley to Harrogate Railway had been relaid over the unnamed graves, and as far as Larry Stern was concerned, the affair was over. It was not, however. The 2 murder victims could have lain undisturbed for 100 years, but apparently they were only going to be allowed to do so for 3. "They're ripping the bloody thing up again," roared Larry, hobbling painfully down Blamire's Lane. Now, it seemed, the Shipley to Harrogate Railway was to be lifted again and the Devil's Throat to be blasted. The old soldier adjusted the sack over his shoulder. A flashlight, a pick, a shovel, and a bundle of old ropes were inside it. "You bloody cow, Marilyn," he muttered. "Even dead you're a flaming bloody nuisance." When he finally arrived on the old playing fields, he struck out quickly towards the railway lines. A fine drizzle was falling, just as it had been 3 years ago. But the place was tranquil now and bathed in silvery moonlight, a smooth expanse of cropped turf. As he squelched his way across it, though, Larry knew full well that within a matter of days this quiet place would be a chaos of building materials again, and that was why he had to hurry. The great hump of the slag heap came looming up ahead of him, amorphous and featureless in the dark, and for the first time that night the old soldier felt a sudden tingle of trepidation. Just for a second he held back, regarding the vast muddy shadow it made on the cloudy grey-black sky. Somewhere under there, Marilyn and her lover awaited him. A chill ran along his spine. "Sod it," he finally hissed, striking out again. The old mesh fence had never been properly repaired and hung from its cruciform structures in shreds for hundreds of yards along the side of the railway. Larry climbed through, scrambling down a steep pebble bank to the metal rails. It was not exactly easy going for a man with one leg, but he made off towards the cutting nevertheless, slipping and skidding on the damp sleepers, tripping on the ring bolts, and swearing volubly. Before him, a veil of impenetrable blackness hung in the deep gorge that was the Devil's Throat. Even under the intense beam of his heavy-duty torch, the complete darkness seemed to advance to meet him rather than retreat. For a moment, it was a formless but solid object filling the old gully, a reaching, hungry thing. Again Larry hung back, momentarily stunned at the illusion. "Load of crap," he finally muttered, stumbling on into the canyon. His unkempt hair was already drenched, and rain splashed from his plastic waterproof onto his sodden jeans, gurgling inside the training shoe he wore on his sole surviving ankle. Such discomfort was no problem for Larry Stern, though. He'd spent too many winter nights bivvied up on the Brecon Mountains during training exercises, or laying face down in ditches out in the green-black hell that was Ulster's bandit country to be concerned about things like that. He huddled deeper into his Mac, hunched his shoulders forward, and pressed ever on into the passage. He feared nothing and nobody, he repeatedly told himself. Nothing and nobody. And suddenly, he received a terrible and sobering shock. Where the old Victorian masonry had clung to the deep sides of the railway cutting 3 years before, Larry's flashlight now showed only roots and crumbling soil. There were some bricks present, of course, but only in piles of rubble on the floor. The cross. The marker. How the hell was he going to find the marker now? Larry stood stock still, aghast, his spine crawling. Involuntarily, he began to shudder violently. All of a sudden, the black rain seemed unbearably cold and fell on him in blinding sheets. In a sudden panic, he began to struggle along the old railway line, plunging deeper into the canyon. Wildly, he scanned the corroding walls with his torch. Everywhere, though, it was the same story. That ancient greened brickwork had long since collapsed. Larry was far from defeated, though. He came rigidly to attention, determined to consider his options in a clear, organised and efficient manner. There could be no mad blundering through the dark here. There was no time for that. First of all, he had to try and remember how far into the passage he had originally marched Marilyn and her lover. Thinking about it, it couldn't have been a lot further than this. Perhaps his best bet was slowly to work his way backwards, examining every fallen brick if need be. He still had hours before daylight. He looked thoughtfully at the nearest heap of rubble and swept over it with his flashlight. And to his astonishment, he saw the white flicker of what looked like chalk on the topmost rock. Larry started, then bounded forwards, training the light downward. It hardly seemed possible, but there, right in front of him, was a hunk of brick marked with a tiny white cross. He could hardly believe it. Too stunned at his good fortune to even speak, and too overwhelmed with relief, Larry backtracked away into the very middle of the railway line and looked down at the mud below him. This was it. This was the very spot. They were buried right underneath him. And then something else attracted his attention. A shrill whistle in the near distance, then a faint hissing and the distinctive rattle of living metal, the sound of mighty wheels storming along stainless steel tracks. Larry looked sharply up and saw in the blackness far ahead of him a minute blot of light which was rapidly growing larger as it approached. Jesus God, he swore. It had never occurred to him that the line might still be operational. He had never dreamed that trains still passed through this cutting. He turned to fling himself to the side, but was roughly pulled backwards. He was caught on something. In a panic, he shone his torch down, and his eyes almost started from their sockets. 4 black arms, twisted and mottled like the dead branches of trees, and with hideous skeletal claws on the end of them, had pushed up through the mud and damp gravel between the sleepers, and were now wrapped around his leg, their steel fingers hooked into the denim. Larry felt the dark and stormy world swimming crazily around him. His tongue filled his throat. His mind spun out of control. "Marilyn," he stuttered, "you bitch!" Then the canyon was filled with light, and a thunderous howl shattered his eardrums. Larry looked directly up at the torrent of fire and steel which filled the canyon from wall to wall, and tumbled headlong towards him. Most of Larry Stern's body was found in Harrogate, but one singular article quickly led the police back to the scene of the tragedy. It was a stout piece of timber, his broken-off wooden leg, in fact. When they actually found it, it was standing upright, jammed between the points in the devil's throat.
Whizz by Robert Eastland. Read by James Baldwin.
The joyriders were careering happily along the country road when the low-flying aircraft screamed past overhead. The force shook the stolen Capri, and Gorty gaped in disbelief as the glowing object rocketed away over the fields, swerving wildly from side to side, but arrowing steadily down and finally impacting in a distant copse of trees with a detonation like a volcanic eruption. The Capri shrieked to a halt by the grassy curb, and the two youths leapt out, running to the farm gate. A secondary explosion lit up the dusk, almost blinding them. It roared like thunder and tossed up a mountain of mud and burning timber, fragments raining down for miles in all directions. It seemed to take minutes for the reverberations to die away. The autumn air was suddenly thick with acrid smoke, and all over the hillside patches of grass were ablaze with an odd yellow-green flame. The wood had virtually vanished. "Oh, shit," breathed Gorty after a second. He hurriedly took the wrap from his jeans pocket and popped another couple of pills. "Oh, man, you see that? A meteor. I'm telling you, a meteor." "Bollocks, a meteor," said Angus, vaulting over the farm gate and venturing into the field. "That was a plane." Gorty joined him. "What? You mean like with people in it?" Angus pushed the baseball cap back on his oily thatch of hair. "What are the kinds of planes they got, dickhead?" They stood in silence, gazing over the field. The same thought seemed to occur to both of them at once. About that film where a down-and-out guy rescued some people from a crashed jet and became a national hero. A rich national hero. Their eyes met. They nodded. Then they began to run, herring across the field. Angus, the stronger and fitter of the two, took the lead, his bright orange trainers shimmering back and forth through the mud and gloom. They found the wood devastated, practically every trunk smashed or bodily uprooted, most of them singed to charcoal and heaped on top of each other. The ground was a disemboweled morass, covered in smoky craters. The car thieves coughed and wafted their arms in front of them as they made their way in. The emerald firelight flickered eerily over them. Then Gorty squawked and jumped backwards, a sudden outburst which spooked Angus. "You dipstick," he snapped. "It was a snake," the other protested. "Slithered right past me, into the field." "So bloody what?" said Angus, pressing on. "Probably had its home wrecked. Never seen a grass snake before." Gorty was nervously scanning the ground, however. It was all black and greasy-like. It moved quick, too. "Never mind that," his mate suddenly said. "Just look at this." The smoke had opened in front of them like curtains to reveal the pulverized remnants of the aircraft, a gigantic hunk of blackened scrap metal still glowing around its edges, but mashed and scrunched and twisted beyond recognition, and belching out searing fumes. It was half buried in the ground. Trees and branches littered all over it, all either smouldering or burning. The two lads could only gaze in disbelief. "No one could have survived in that," said Gorty after a moment. "Hardly surprising," Angus replied. "Must have been doing 1,000 miles an hour when it hit. Easy." "What kind of a plane does that?" asked the other after a moment. Angus shook his head. He didn't know much about aeroplanes as it was, but there was nothing at all he recognised here. Curved, razor-edged fins were visible, one still attached, another embedded in a tree trunk. There was no trace of any wings, but masses of tentacle-thick cables dangled like ripped innards through the many rents in the bodywork, most still sparking and jumping. "Don't reckon it's one of them UFOs, do you?" Corty suddenly wondered, the eyes wide in his sooty face. Angus shrugged and turned sharply. Far in the distance he could hear the wail of approaching sirens. "Quick," he hissed, charging back out into the field. "Coppers! If they find that knocker, we've had it." Minutes later they were back in the Ford Capri, panting for breath but gibbering with laughter. "Let's see if they bother coming after us now," crowed Gorty, as Angus hot-wired the engine again and jammed his foot down. The Capri leapt away from the curb just as the first police car came screeching around the bend in the road. By the cacophony of sirens behind it, and myriad of blue lights flashing through the hedgerows, a whole army of emergency vehicles was in immediate support. If the officers even noticed the stolen Capri, though, now roaring away up the country lane, a trail of dust behind it, they didn't react. Gorty looked in the rear-view mirror and saw their silhouettes clambering over the farm gate. "Pity there wasn't no one there to save," he said. He popped another pill and gave one to Angus, who slammed it into his mouth with a chuckle. "Doesn't matter. The more dead, the better. Keep 'em busy for ages, that. Let's have some fun." He pulled a handbrake turn at the next sharp bend, then hit a stretch of open road, flooring the accelerator. Gorty whooped drunkenly as the car bounced over a pothole, then landed hard, and with a squeal of blistered tyres, tore off into the night. Trees and hedgerows flickered past them. The benighted countryside was soon an obsidian blur. "Oh, man!" screamed Gorty as the speedometer rode steadily up through the 90-plus mark. "This is living!" Angus began to howl like a wolf. They'd already had some fun in this particular motor, but it was an old model, and up until now he hadn't been able to get it past 80. Not far ahead, framed in a blaze of sodium streetlights, a crossroads came hurtling towards them. Angus gave a warning, "Whoa!" then hit the brakes hard. But nothing happened. And the engine was still revving, apparently at maximum velocity, even though Angus had taken his foot clean off the gas. At first the young hoodlum thought it was the drugs in his system playing up. He pedalled the brake wildly, but still the car surged on, the engine grinding. Gorty didn't notice and continued to laugh crazily. They flew over the crossroads at terrifying speed, plunging down an unlit lane. Angus was still slamming his foot down on the brake as hard as he could and eyeing the speedometer with incredulity. The needle was now touching 110. What the hell? What the bloody hell? The headlights picked out a sharp bend ahead, and he had to drag the steering wheel over to get round it. The car never even slowed, however, its tyres shrieking. Gorty's head was thrown hard against the passenger window, spider-webbing it with cracks and knocking him out of his reverie. He cried out sharply at the pain. I can't control it," jabbered Angus. "Oh, Christ! What the hell's wrong with it?" They hit another open stretch and accelerated again. The world now zipped past invisibly. All that existed was the twisting, turning strip of blacktop in front, and they were eating it up. "Slow down!" Gorty began to shout, trying to grab the wheel, but Angus fought him off. "I'm trying to, you prat! Look, I'm not even driving it!" Gorty gazed in disbelief at the bright orange feet, both frantically pumping the brake. "It's doing it itself!" Angus screamed, his voice now hysterical. He yanked the handbrake on, but it did nothing, and now another wide curve in the road was approaching, the zigzag black and white signs sweeping towards them. Gorty buried his head in his hands while Angus wrenched the wheel over again. The Capri took the bend practically on two wheels, its motor howling. Beyond that, a straight road led down to a major dual carriageway. The car literally bulleted out into it, sending other vehicles spinning out of its way. Smoke was now spilling from the engine, and the needle resting on 140, the Capri's maximum. Still, it made no difference. Street lights and cars whistled backwards past them. The knuckles in Angus's hands gleamed white as he clenched the wheel. He could no longer speak. His eyes were starting from his face, his teeth chattering. Gorty felt himself being pressed back into the seat with G-force, his stomach rolling. For a mindless second, he wondered if he could possibly get out, if he could just open the door and flop onto the hard shoulder, if he would survive. Near paralysis held him where he was, though. The car was now going faster than it had ever been designed to do. 170 at least, maybe more. The frame was shaking violently around them, lurching from side to side on its suspension. The smoke and stench of burning rubber was almost intolerable. Gorty remembered the strange craft racing out of control at over 1,000 miles an hour. In a broken, simpering voice, he began to pray. Behind them, other vehicles were careering back and forth all over the road, and a police traffic patrol was coming up in hot pursuit, sirens blaring, but still a good way behind. Inevitably, they never even saw the contraflow until they were ploughing through it. Not that they would have been able to do anything about it anyway. Gorty tried to climb into the back seat, got stuck halfway. Angus simply clasped his hands to his face. Through his crooked fingers, he had one fleeting glimpse of workmen in fluorescent slickers racing out of the way, a fountain of traffic cones going up and up in front of his fender, then girders, concrete mixers, bulldozers, the massive granite buttress of a half-built bridge looming right at them. Angus screamed. By the time the traffic patrol pulled up beside the scattered wreckage, a tribe of workmen was standing about in it, talking together in hushed disbelief. As the cop climbed out, the foreman came up to him, pale face under his bright yellow helmet. Together they picked their way for yards through the smouldering debris towards the car's main chassis. It was flattened like a sardine tin and partly buried in the buttress of the bridge, which had cracked all the way through and now hung at a deadly angle. As they peered in, swatting at the foul smoke, neither of them noticed the black serpentine shape worm its way out underneath the smashed hulk. For a second it lay in a coil on the scorched tarmac, palpitating, spotted with moisture, almost like sweat. Then it slithered away. The only thing instantly identifiable on either of the two mangled corpses inside the car, meanwhile, was a pair of bright orange training shoes, dangling off two charred and partially severed feet. The traffic cop paled and took off his hat. "Jesus, I know that lad," he breathed. "From the Brooker estate back in town. That explains everything." He shook his head wearily and mopped sweat from his brow. "It'll be the usual thing. Whizz, speed. They've no self-control. They're just addicted to it." A few feet away, the glistening black snake thing was rippling excitedly through the grass on the hard shoulder. Not far ahead of it, a 20-ton HGV sat chugging in the moonlight.
Somebody in the Garden by Robert Eastland, read by John Pertwee.
The garden at the front of the empty house was a virtual jungle, especially in the summer, when dense, matted vegetation grew right up to the door and bay window, making access to the building practically impossible. It even hung over the front fence, forming a canopy for the pavement. A drive ran backwards down one side of the house to an old garage, but the thick foliage along either edge of it left only a narrow footpath of cracked, mossy concrete. John Soames, who lived opposite, thought it was a sight, and that it badly let down their neat little road of detached houses. "It would have helped," he said over his paper one evening to his wife Iris, "if that friend Molly of yours had had the good grace to leave the blasted house in her will to someone." "Oh, why's that, dear?" said Iris, happy with her knitting. John shook his head and went back to his paper. Iris was getting just a wee bit scatty these days. She talked to the canary more than she talked to him, and was often to be found, when she had nothing to do, gazing off into space, a serene expression on her face. She and that Molly Ragley had been an ideal pair for each other. Exasperated, John got up from his armchair and walked across to the lounge windows. In the evening twilight, the empty house looked even gloomier and more overgrown than normal. I mean, why can't they just sell the place to someone? Well, apparently it's still in Molly's family, dear, said Iris. John grunted. He had heard this explanation half a dozen times before, and it still made no sense to him. The old woman's husband, Norman, had died 6 years before she had, and their only son, Carl, had been killed in a road accident when he was 19. The whole thing was totally baffling. It made him more determined than ever to keep his own front garden immaculate, and he went out early the following morning to rake weeds out of the deep flower beds. It didn't do his bad back much good, though, and several times he found himself clutching at his throbbing spine. On the last occasion, Iris saw him from the window and came outside, saying that he wished he would come in and have a rest, as he'd clearly done enough for one day. Grimacing with pain, his wrinkled brow and bald pate beaded with sweat, John waved her back indoors, insisting he was all right. It was all that Molly Ragley's fault, he thought bitterly. If only she'd left her papers and deeds properly sorted out. He worked all the harder, continually glaring at the house across the road, almost as though he expected it to sense his disapproval and try to tidy itself up. That was when John, just for a fleeting second, fancied he saw somebody moving about in the thick undergrowth. He straightened up, staring curiously at the old property. There it was again. A tall figure was definitely moving about over there. But it wasn't in the garden at the front. It was in the garden at the rear, and the reason John had seen it was because Molly's old front room was connected by a big arch to her dining room, which looked out at the back. Well, gazing in through her front bay window, which was what he was doing now, though Lord knows it took some doing with that equatorial rainforest in front of it, you could peer straight through the house and out into the back garden. And somebody was definitely walking about back there. John almost strained his eyes, trying to see the figure again, but there was no sign of him now. John began to worry. There was no doubt that, whoever it was, they should not be there. Well, it couldn't have been someone going to view the house, because he hadn't seen them enter, and, as Iris said, the place wasn't even for sale yet. The ugly thought occurred to him that it might be squatters, or drug addicts looking for somewhere to hide out. That would be all they needed. If things weren't bad enough already with the house looking an overgrown wreck and bringing down the quality of the neighbourhood, now it was attracting undesirables from the slums. Well, there was no way that was happening here, he thought, decisively. He'd had just about enough of all this. He hadn't landed in Normandy and fought his way across the Rhine and then slaved his guts out for 40 years running a post office to have his retirement ruined by people who hadn't done a day's work in their lives and insisted on spending their time being as indecent and antisocial as possible. Picking up his spade, he marched across the road to the Ragley house and unlatched the rusty iron gates at the front. At this point, his resolve almost faltered. He looked up at the brooding structure. Its red brick walls were badly stained, its drain pipes loose and broken, but for all that it was hard to imagine that Molly Ragley was no longer living there. She'd certainly had a presence, that dotty old woman. Her husband and son had known who the boss was. She had a real hold over them. Shaking his head, he opened the gate and made his way up the drive to the front door. He'd already decided that he wouldn't go straight round the back and confront the trespassers, but would first take a look through the window and see if he could identify them from a safer distance. Now, just getting to the bay window was difficult, however. He had to fight his way through dense leafy boughs, which whipped him in the face and snagged his cardigan before he made it. And even then he was trampling through thick weeds and thigh-high nettles. and it was all apparently for nothing. When he finally looked in, he could see quite clearly through the gloomy cave of the lounge and the dining room beyond it out into the back garden, but there was no sign of movement. Moments passed. All John could identify was some greenery and the distant back wall. Nobody seemed to be walking around. Perhaps there was a back gate. John had to admit that he wasn't really sure. He'd known Norman Ragley quite well, but not as well as Iris had known Molly, certainly not well enough to invite himself over and view the back garden. The only thing for it was to wander round and investigate. Bravely, he hacked his way back through the foliage with his spade, and then crept down the drive towards the garage. There was a lattice-work fence beside it with a gate in the middle. John paused. Nothing was visible beyond the fence because of climbing rose bushes on the other side of it. And so he listened. But he didn't hear a thing. He waited for a second, his heart thumping, and then lifted the latch and entered. What he saw quite simply staggered him. It was not the fact that there was nobody there. That became apparent immediately. But it was the state of the garden itself. While the front was a straggling mass of weeds and thorns which made no one enter, man or beast, the rear could have been designed and created by Capability Brown. The lawns were smooth as silk and bordered by glorious flower beds. The three walls enclosing it all were covered in lush ivy and big red flowers. It was immaculately kept, not a plant or a stone out of place, not a single weed was in sight, nor a leaf strewn on the grass. For minutes, John wandered about the garden in a dream. The mellow sun and gentle twittering of birds made it at once restful and relaxing. And yet he was too perplexed to fully appreciate it. It put his own paltry lawn and vegetable patch to shame. But that was understandable, because whoever kept a garden up to this standard must be tending it 7 days a week. Perhaps the person he'd seen walking around was the gardener. But why? Why spend so much loving care on this neglected place, and for whom? And where had he just vanished to? John glanced suddenly over his shoulder, half expecting to see the gardener standing behind him. There was nobody there. The windows at the back of the house were just like those at the front, empty, blind apertures. John tried to get into the shed, but found it locked, and then patrolled the walls to see if perhaps the ivy was hiding some door. But again, there was nothing. None of it made sense. Later on, over tea, when he told Iris about it, she didn't seem remotely surprised. "Well, Molly always loved that back garden of hers," she said. "She used to call it her little Eden." "But Iris, Molly's dead," said John impatiently. "She has been for 2 years." Iris shrugged as she poured the tea. "If what you say is true, her gardener must keep coming. Maybe she didn't have time to cancel his contract." "Oh, don't be ridiculous," he scoffed. "And anyway, why doesn't he do the front as well?" Molly sniffed and said nothing. "And I never knew her to have a gardener," John muttered, lifting the cup to his mouth. "Ever." On several occasions over the following weeks, John crossed over to look at the rear garden. There was never anybody there, but it was clearly being cared for. Just as an experiment, one Friday, he deliberately dropped litter in the middle of the lawn. And when he next checked the following day, it had been swept away, but not by the wind, because he found it in the waste bin beside the compost heap. It was all too bewildering. He now spent much more time in his own front garden, despite Iris's concerned warning about his tired, aching back, purely to keep an eye on the Ragley house. And then it occurred to him that maybe he was watching out at the wrong time of day. Gardeners, presumably, kept to regular schedules, and the first occasion he thought he'd glimpsed the mysterious figure had been early in the morning. It seemed an odd time to be at work, but who knew? Maybe a gardener as skilled as this one was in demand and had a lot more than one garden to tend to during his working day. So the following morning, John arose earlier than usual, dressed and equipped with hoe and clippers, went out into his own front garden. As always, he was scrutinizing the Ragley house from the moment that he went outside. Nothing moved. Absurdly, John felt total disappointment. He just wanted the mystery solving, that was all. He'd been banking on the man being there at this time. Irritably, he threw his tools down and crossed the road to get a closer look. It was an angry, frustrating struggle through the undergrowth before he got to the bay window. Even then, he saw no one at the other side of the house. Well, he'd just checked for himself. He'd bloody well go and check. Chuntering in disgust, he made his way down the side of the house and let himself into the back garden. They were there. The gardeners. Both of them. Working in silence. John froze. He hadn't seen them through the window because one was crouching down, weeding the flower beds, and the other one by the wall, trimming the ivy. The shed, he noticed, was now open. It was foul and black within. He stared hard at the two gardeners as though through a telescope, and had a vague impression of ragged old clothes, grey sweaters, sun hats, scruffy trousers, and then the faces. The faces, when they looked curiously round at him. The faces. There wasn't much left of them, really. The next thing John knew, he was staggering across the road, a series of squawks and squeals coming out of his throat. The world was spinning around him, and by the time he reached his house and blundered into the kitchen, he was wringing with sweat. He couldn't tell Iris what he'd seen. He could only point blindly back towards the Ragley house, gibbering senselessly, and then he fainted. When he came round again, John was lying in a bed with a thermometer in his mouth. By the twilight outside the window, he could tell that it was mid-evening. Somewhere close by, he could hear a metallic clicking noise which he couldn't quite place. He lay there, confused for a moment, and then the horror came flooding back to him, and he seized the bedsheets. At that point, Iris came jauntily in and beamed to see him awake. She had a glass of water and some tablets for him, she said. He stammered out something which even he knew was meaningless drivel, but she only told him to relax, not to excite himself. It was the house and the gardeners, he told her. The house and the gardeners. Now, John, please, she said sternly. It's all right. I've been over there to see what happened, and it's all right. Oh, all right, he repeated in disbelief. Did you not see? Did you not see? She interrupted him sharply. Of course I did, but it's all right now. You will go nosying around, won't you? You know that Molly liked to keep her garden nice, and no one did it like Norman and Carl. And like you always say, she did have quite a hold over them. John tried to scream, but couldn't. Iris was still talking, though. For once, things have turned out very well. She gave him another radiant smile. The metal clicking noise seemed louder. It sounded like it was right outside the house. Apparently, Molly arranged it so that they only worked early mornings, she went on. Mainly because she didn't want them seen during the day. Understandable, I suppose. But, well, that doesn't mean they couldn't do a bit in the evenings, does it? She leaned over and rubbed her nose against his. Or two such nice men. My hubby-dubby's not going to have to suffer with his poor old back anymore. That was when John realized what the clicking sound was. Hoe and hedge clippers. Somebody, it seemed, was working in the garden. And this time, he did manage to scream.
The Ogre of the Scraggs by Robert Eastland, read by Bill Oddie.
The two young brothers from the council estate literally belted along on their mountain bikes. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was out, they had grub and pop in their school rucksacks, and all they needed now was Jukesy. They followed the canal towpath for an hour, then took off along a cinder track which wound quickly uphill. Town was already a smoky smudge in the valley behind them. They travelled past the old reservoir, then along a narrow lane through freshly ploughed farmland. A flock of ravens took off from the furrows as the two lads scooted past. The picked cottages came next, a terraced row surrounded by allotments, and finally the little footpath snaking off through overgrown wasteland towards the Scraggs. They didn't know the Scraggs so well. Few kids from that part of town did, but they'd all heard about it. They'd all heard quite a lot. That was why they needed Jukesy. He'd been living up this way all his life, and reckoned he knew the Scraggs like the back of his hand. He was a year above Gavin, the elder of the two brothers, and 3 above Timmy, so they automatically assumed that he knew what he was talking about. At school, when he'd told them that no one was advised to go scrambling on the Scraggs without his guidance, they were certain that he was right. One thing was for sure. All the mums and dads they knew wanted their kids to stay away from the place. Far too dangerous for messing about on, they'd say. None of them ever elaborated on this, though, so the sense of mystery was enhanced. It made lads like Gavin and Timmy, who shared a bedroom and could look out of its window into an overgrown yard with broken-down fences and an alley strewn with rubbish, want to go and explore even more. It made the Scraggs, 30 acres of barren slag heaps left behind after the demolition of the old coal wash, seem like the Everglades or the Australian outback. As a battlefield or an alien planet, it had no equal, and its scrambling tracks were supposed to be the best ever. But then there was the legend of the ogre. Young Timmy wasn't too keen on that, but Gavin told him it was piffle. It was just something made up by parents to keep lads off the Scraggs. He was sure Jukesy would put them straight. The Scraggs were surrounded by private fields and could only be reached by an old railway cutting, now devoid of rails and sleepers, and used as a bridle path. This was where Jukesy was waiting for them. The cutting was so deep in weeds that they had to wheel their bikes along it. Jukesy, who appeared at the top of the embankment, was scornful of this. He laughed as he cruised down to them on his own bike, easily handling the rubble and undergrowth. Embarrassed, they both mounted up. Their friend wasn't so amused by the time he got down to them, however. He looked past them, perplexed. "Well, where are the birds?" he asked. He was lean and tall, with wolfish good looks, and he had the power to make other youngsters uncomfortable with an expression. Gavin shrugged, red-faced. Our sis wouldn't come," Timmy piped up. She said it was kid stuff, and without her mate wouldn't come either." Jukesy snorted with irritation. "So, I'm stuck on the Scraggs with you two all day then, am I?" What's wrong?" Timmy asked. But Jukesy ignored him, and Gavin told him to keep quiet. Without another word, the older boy pedalled strongly off along the bridle path, leaving the other two to struggle along after him. They rode in silence for several minutes, weaving through increasingly denser undergrowth, before Jukesy suddenly pulled off the track and powered his way slowly up a steep path to the top of the embankment. There was no way the other two could manage that, and both were forced to carry their bikes up. Jukesy waited impatiently at the top. He was wearing the frown of someone facing a long, hard day. While he sat there, he dug a cigarette out of his leather jacket and lit it. "I told you "To make sure you had some women with you," he said, as they came staggering and panting to the top. "That was the idea." Timmy looked accusingly at Gavin. You said we were coming to do some scrambling." "I didn't tell you to come, did I?" Gavin snapped back at him. Jukesy watched them both and smoked hard. Gavin was stocky, with freckles and red hair. Timmy, a shorter, plumper version. Both were dressed in tracksuits, gloves and baseball caps. The older lad eventually snorted with contempt. "Townies. Probably reckon you're pretty tough. I tell you, you wouldn't last 5 minutes up here without me." Neither replied. Timmy was still scowling at Gavin, who was too embarrassed to say anything. Jukesy finished his cigarette, then, without another word, turned about and pedalled quickly away. For the first time they noticed the bleak, savage wonderland of the Scraggs, stretching out before them. Eagerly they set off into it. In all directions, great hummocks of slag and clinker rolled off to the far horizon, usually with deep gullies between them, full of scrub and stunted trees. Here and there, often at the foot of precarious, crumbling cliffs, stretches of eerie yellow water rippled and stank. Jukesy said they were called flashes. They were supposed to be bottomless, and they were almost certainly poisonous to drink. For several minutes they cycled along rough scrambling routes, often skidding on the loose, broken surface or plunging sharply down steep inclines. Beyond every ridge they found another. Nothing pleasant-looking seemed to grow there, however. There was no sign of any wildlife. Even the birds didn't sing. In fact, the silence quickly grew oppressive, and Gavin found it amazing that a place could exist so close to town where a bunch of lads could ride around on their bikes for hours and never see a living soul. Clearly some people had been around. Wasted building materials like concrete slabs, rusty barbed wire, or gigantic sections of sewer pipes were littered along some of the valley bottoms, and all were covered in spray-on graffiti. There was nobody there at the moment, though. Gavin wasn't surprised. Jukesy eventually pulled off on one of the higher tracks, skidded to a halt, and lit up another cigarette. The other two lads braked gratefully behind him. For a few moments, there was complete silence. The moonscape spread out endlessly around them and made a horrible picture of dirt and desolation. There was a reek of sulphur in the air, and both Gavin and Timmy's trainers were already thickly caked in clay, their tracksuit pants heavily spattered. They said nothing, but waited patiently for Jukesy to finish his cigarette, which he seemed in no great hurry to do. "Bet you've never ridden tracks like this before, eh?" he finally said. Gavin grunted, not wanting to give it away that he found the place a bit too lonely. What about the ogre?" Timmy suddenly asked. Jukesy sniggered, as if he'd been waiting all day to see which one of them would bring it up first. "Why? You scared?" he wondered. Timmy insisted that he wasn't, but his trembling bottom lip told a different story. Jukesy laughed, then took another long drag on his cigarette. After a moment, he looked back at Timmy. A thin smile appeared on his face. It's not a load of bollocks, you know," he said. "Adults say it is. But I no different." Timmy gazed at him, awe-stricken, but Gavin wondered if it was time they were getting on. Jukesy made no move to ride off, but lit another cigarette. It's supposed to be some kind of ghost," he said, throwing the match away. "Only, this ghost attacks at people. Sometimes even kills them. Timmy swallowed hard. Gavin chuckled, pretending it was all a good joke, but a piercing look from Jukesy shut him up smartly. This isn't the ghost of a person, you see, he explained. It's supposed to be something they dug up when they were dropping the first pit shafts. Some kind of evil spirit. It's been roaming around this place for about 200 years now. Gavin didn't know whether Jukesy was having them on or not, but he could sense that Timmy was getting frightened. Look, Jukesy, I've come here to scramble, not listen, Jukesy laughed. Soft little git, he said. Gavin protested. It's not that, but Jukesy shouted in down. Course it's that! Course it's that! Do you want to hear? Or are you too scared as well, eh? Gavin didn't like being shown up in front of his younger brother. What is there to hear? He snapped. Jukesy smiled again. All sorts of stuff. For instance, back in my granddad's day, when all the pits were working, there was this gypsy fella, see. Nobody liked him. They reckoned he were a thief. Said he were always nicking stuff from the colliery baths. Well, eventually, the bobbies came looking for him. So, he scarpered out here to the Scrags. They found him 3 days later, dead. When they slit him open in hospital to see what had killed him, they found the guts had been taken out of his belly, and he'd been stuffed with all the clobber he'd nicked over the years. Watches, cash, bits of jewellery, even old socks and boots. They were all crammed inside him. Timmy's eyes were almost starting from his skull with horror, but Gavin tried to laugh it down. It's true, Jukesy insisted in a casual voice. A bit further along the railway cutting where you came up, there's an old cabin. It was in there, where they found his body. Likes a good joke, our ogre. There was another one, more recent. You might remember it. Happened a few years back. There was this lad who was a good footballer. Turned professional on his 17th birthday. Really skillful he was. The new Georgie Best, they all said. Anyway, he reckoned he were going to start training on the Scrags. You know, running up and down the slag heaps. Everyone said he was balmy, but he just laughed at them. He said he weren't scared of nothing. Well, very first time, he didn't come home again. His dad and uncle went looking for him. They found him around midnight. Somewhere out here. Crawling around on the floor. He'd gone totally crazy, you see. You know why? Because his feet had been swapped round. I've never heard that, said Gavin. Jukesy shrugged. Well, they keep stories like that away from kids, don't they? Have you ever seen him? Asked Timmy, his voice a whisper. Jukesy shrugged. Nobody has. And lived, or stayed sane. Don't know why, though. I'm up here all the time. I reckon there's just some that he leaves alone. Now it was Gavin's turn to scoff. What? What you mean like you're too dangerous for him, eh? The whole thing was clearly a sham, he decided. Elaborate, clever, but basically a Mickey take by a bored guy with nothing else to do. He laughed. Jukesy looked sharply round at him. Then he threw his cigarette away. You little bastard! All right. If that's what you think, well then, let's just see how you do on your bloody own. and he was away, pedalling furiously, chunks of clinker flying up behind him. Timmy cried out and made to follow immediately, but his brother stopped him. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Let him go." But he knows there's cracks, and we don't," Timmy protested. Gavin assured him they'd be all right, however. All they had to do was get back to the railway cutting. They'd easily find their way from there. Worriedly, Timmy agreed and began to turn his bike around. Gavin stared after Jukesy. The older lad had already made good ground, crossing the next valley, and was now a diminutive figure cycling laboriously away up a deep cleft between the next two slag heaps. Then, something else caught Gavin's eye. Just fleetingly. In no more than a flash, he thought he'd seen a second figure, much taller than Jukesy, and just vanishing down over the ridge of the next heap, as though hurrying to meet up with him. Suddenly, Gavin felt uncomfortable. What are we waiting for?" Timmy wondered, his bike now pointing back along the trail. Nothing," said Gavin, quickly mounting up. Minutes later, they were jolting their way back over the near-volcanic landscape, pumping hard at the pedals. It all looked the same, however. Over each new rise, more deserted terrain awaited them, always with half a dozen potential routes leading off in different directions. What was worse, leaden clouds now stretched from horizon to horizon, threatening rain. Do you really know where we're going?" Timmy asked from behind for the umpteenth time. Gavin looked back with irritation and saw to his shock that somebody was running after them. He blinked, and the figure had gone. His hair began to prickle. Just for a second then, he fancied some shape had gone pounding out of sight behind the last rise. Some big, big shape. He began to hammer his pedals, shouting for Timmy to keep up. Then the rain began to fall, in torrents. It swept over them in icy sheets. Timmy cried out, his voice now a childish whine, and Gavin screamed at him to keep up. He glanced over his shoulder again, but the landscape behind was lost in a curtain of rain. He strained his eyes to penetrate the murk. Then, suddenly, felt the ground give way beneath his front wheel. With a shriek, he felt himself plummeting down a terrifying gradient, sodden bushes whipping him in the face, the saddle bouncing violently in his crotch. He heard a distant shouting from Timmy as he too went over the hidden precipice. For mindless moments the world was rushing past. Then Gavin was thrown hard onto his face. He found himself lying in mud and trampled thistles. His clothes were soaked through, and the rain still swept over him. He rolled onto his back, just as Timmy came skidding down the steep embankment. He too went over his handlebars, the front wheel of his bike visibly buckling with the impact. Gavin scrambled across to him, frantically scanning the top of the slope. It was hidden in scrub and low trees, all now tossing wildly in the wind and rain. Anything could be coming through it, and he wouldn't even notice. Timmy's face was a mask of dirt and tears when his brother dragged him to his feet. He'd lost his baseball cap, and his tracksuit was torn in several places. But Gavin just told him to shut up. It was all right, he said. They were back at the railway cutting, and it was all right. Timmy then began sobbing about his bike. But Gavin told him to forget it. They'd get home on foot. He began to push his younger brother along the canyon, which was deep in tangled thorns. The rain was still washing over them, and for a minute it really was like some jungle adventure. Then the ugliness of reality came hurtling back, for there was a sudden violent thrashing in the vegetation behind them, as though some huge object was coming through, at terrible speed. A bizarre, non-human squawk accompanied it. "Run!" Gavin screamed, and he charged headlong. Timmy followed. For seconds they blundered through, ripping clothes and flesh alike, constantly falling on stones or into deep puddles. Suddenly Timmy grabbed Gavin's shoulder and pointed with shaking finger to the foot of the embankment, where a small red-brick cabin was half buried in dense foliage. Its windows and doors had long been smashed in, and its roof was a sagging mess of old tar paper. But it was a shelter of a sort, and a possible hiding place. Gavin nodded, and they scrambled over to it, ducking straight inside. It was damp and dripping in there, and deep in nettles. None of that seemed to matter now, though. For seconds, they squatted there, backs to the wall, hardly daring to breathe. Their drenched clothes steaming. Suddenly, Timmy's eyes widened as a terrible thought occurred to him. This is that railway cabin, isn't it? Where they found that bloke who'd been stuffed with clobber. Gavin felt his blood run cold. He couldn't bring himself to lie, because he knew that it had to be. It could only be. He looked slowly around him, almost expecting to see the body of the slaughtered gypsy still curled up in some corner. Timmy had gone white. He seemed about to faint. Then they heard the unearthly squawk again. This time it was very close, perhaps just outside the cabin. With an abrupt sigh, Timmy did pass out, falling sideways into the weeds. Gavin tried to reach out for him, but he couldn't. Heavy feet were now kicking through the undergrowth outside, coming towards the cabin doorway. A shadow fell through it. The moisture on Gavin had literally turned to ice. He felt his bowels about to break, and then the figure stepped in through the doorway. It stood there, swaying. For a moment, Gavin couldn't breathe. Then all of a sudden, he could again, because it was Jukesy. He was soaked through, just like Gavin and Timmy. But there was blood on his chin, and dirt on his ashen cheeks, and his eyes gazed down at them with a feverish intensity. Gavin had to laugh, though. He had to laugh so hard that his ribs were soon aching. And just for once, Jukesy was in no position to rebuke him. Not with his mouth zipped up.
A Lesson Never Learned by Paul Finch. Read by Peter Bowles.
The dual carriageway went on for miles, coloured like copper in the dull sodium streetlights, and rippling on through the black, empty fields of mid-October. Mervyn Rosethorn yawned at the steering wheel. Good God, it was only 7:30 and he was bored already. How typical. Still, this was the travel writer's lot. It was how he made such a fat living, after all. Mind you, it wasn't so often he got invited back to towns he'd rubbished. In fact, this was the first time ever. The mayor said he would just like to entertain you over dinner and perhaps show you a different side to Ingley Wells, the young woman had said on the telephone. Maybe change your mind about our town. Well, it wouldn't, he thought smugly. They could treat him to all the free meals they liked, but none of that would make him think any better of that bleak little blotch of concrete far out in the wilds of Lincolnshire. Ordinarily, he wouldn't even have considered it, but the truth was it might make a chapter in his next book. The previous one in which Ingley Wells had featured had been called Salutary Lessons, Towns Which Ought to Die of Shame. The next one would be Lessons Never Learnt, Towns Which Wouldn't Die of Shame. A return to the now infamous Ingley Wells would be a welcome tonic to his readership, he was sure. It was all of a bit of a joke, really. Nothing too serious. Mr. Rosethorn always wrote humorously about the places he visited, and he'd assassinated far better towns than this one. Mind you, Ingley Wells was one of the so-called new towns. As a rule, they tended to be more defensive than others. Well, they could either accept his criticisms or not. That was up to them. But if the mayor of Ingley Wells thought he could buy a best-selling author off simply by throwing him a few crusts from his table, he had another thing coming. Unless Mr. Rosethorn saw some serious contrition on the part of Ingley Wells's city fathers, and maybe plans to do away with its horrendous tangle of concrete towers, subways, and overpasses, then this time he'd be really ruthless. He might even tell them that over dinner. The memory of the invitation made him mildly uncomfortable, however. How had they known that he was in nearby Newark, for example? It wasn't always possible for an author's life to be his own, but surely he'd made this pilgrimage in some secret. He preferred to arrive at his target boroughs unannounced, so that their ruling elite wouldn't have time to cover up the urban disasters he'd soon be joyously cataloguing. He snickered. That could be his opening line, perhaps. Had they been spying on me, the sad and shifty old men who preside over this citadel of cement? All of a sudden, it didn't seem that funny. He cleared his throat and drove on. Not far ahead, his headlights picked up a road sign. Ingley Wells 4. That was good. Another few minutes and he'd be there. Though at this rate he'd probably be alone. Scarcely another car had passed him since his departure from the A17. And who could blame them? The place was well off the beaten track. As the turn-off approached, he braked gently and guided his Jag down the slip road. It curved sharply away from the carriageway and swung through a dense copse of skeletal trees, which closed in tightly on either side. The surface was bumpy, too. Mr. Rosethorn cursed. If there was such a thing as a C-class road, or even a D-class, then this was surely it. That was when he noticed that he was low on petrol. He swore again. He hadn't checked the level when he'd set out, but he'd only filled up yesterday. He hadn't done that much driving. He pressed on resignedly. There was enough left for him to get to the town, but he supposed he'd better fill up somewhere. By good fortune, the first building to come along was a petrol station, and he pulled up thankfully onto its forecourt, digging into his tuxedo to check that he had his wallet and credit cards. He had, and he climbed out of the car and stretched before turning to the pumps. They were switched off, however, and behind them he saw that the office was locked. There was no light within, and a sign on the door simply read, "Closed." A metal grille had been fixed over the windows. Mr. Rosethorn stood there for a moment perplexed. It wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. Then something caught his eye, a flickering light in the trees beyond the forecourt. He walked across to get a better look and stopped at the barrier. Through the naked branches, on some open ground, he saw several figures holding burning torches, apparently preparing a huge bonfire which they had not yet lit. Mr. Rosethorn watched them carefully. At first, he thought they were children, but it soon became obvious they weren't. They were all far too big and cumbersome. They were building up the fire with armfuls of junk from cardboard boxes. But no, it wasn't junk. It was... Mr. Rosethorn felt a mild jolt. It was books. Piles and piles of books. It would have been easy to call out to them, to ask what they were doing and why the filling station was closed, but Mr. Rosethorn didn't. He had no desire to attract their attention at all. In fact, he practically skipped back across the forecourt, jumped into his car and drove quickly off. It could only be another mile at most. He'd make it. When he'd originally described the centre of Ingley Wells as a relentless succession of faceless concrete structures, each indistinguishable from the last, he hadn't really meant it. Perhaps he should have done, because once in that centre, he was soon lost in a complex web of byways and intersections. One roundabout followed another. Everywhere there were traffic lights, crossroads, and one-way signs. Mr. Rosethorn tried to negotiate it single-handed while staring at the directions he'd scribbled down during the telephone conversation. They didn't seem to make sense, and he cursed himself for his habit of never listening properly. To make things worse, for some reason, there was nobody round to ask. He sighed irritably as he drove about, seeing not a living soul. He'd heard of towns that closed at sundown, but this was ridiculous. There wasn't even any traffic on the road. He supposed he should look out for a civic building, a town hall type thing, but whichever way he turned, the skyline was dominated by blocks of flats, multi-story car parks, or big glass and steel shopping centres. All now closed, it went without saying. Mr. Rosethorn glanced at the digital clock on his dashboard. It read 7:49. He was going to be late, whatever happened. Then his engine cut out. There was a loud clunk, a violent shudder, then nothing. The Jag cruised steadily to a halt. The author stared dumbly at the fuel gauge, its needle now resting firmly on empty. Several minutes passed before he managed to straighten himself out and climb from the car, refusing to be ruffled. He put his hands into his trouser pockets and set off walking. He wasn't quite sure which direction to take, but the end of the street was a start. There was still no sign of anyone, but he could hear the faint rumble of distant town traffic. From the next corner he spied what looked like a bus station, a regimented grid of slip roads and steel shelters. There was nobody there, but in the middle of it he saw a long, low building of brick with lights shining out. He sauntered over and made his way to the front, where he found an office door with the word "Information" over the top of it. Relieved, he entered. Not that there was anybody inside, however. The office was clearly open for business. It was fully lit, with a heater on and ledgers spread out on the counter, but there was no staff. Mr. Rosethorn waited for a moment, glancing at his watch. On the other side of the counter, an open door led into a back room, where a table was visible with tea things on it. He suddenly had the oddest feeling that somebody was in there, listening to him. He cleared his throat. "Hello? Hello?" At first, there was no reply. And then, ever so slowly, a guttural chuckle. A hideous, pig-like sound rolled out from the tea room. At first the author thought he was hearing things. Then the chuckle came again. Mr. Rosethorn had never counted courage among his foremost qualities. He backed from the office, and after a second turned and walked stiffly away. He suddenly felt very alone and unsure of himself. What the hell was going on? He stopped for a moment, took out his silk handkerchief and dabbed his forehead, and across the road saw a bus full of passengers waiting at a stop, its engine throbbing. He hurried over to it. At least they'd be able to give him some directions. As he rounded the back of the vehicle, however, it juddered and belched out fumes, clearly about to pull away. Mr. Rosethorn began to run. He reached the front and found it had old-fashioned folding doors, their glass panes too steamed up to see through. He rapped loudly on them, hoping the driver would open up again. The driver didn't, however, and the bus inched slowly forwards. Numerous passengers were gazing down on him, their faces smudged and half-formed behind the smeared, steamy windows. They continued to watch him, even as the bus drove noisily away. Mr. Rosethorn stared after it in mute disbelief until it was gone. Then a rustling noise attracted his attention. He looked across the road at a patch of wasteland previously concealed by the bus. 3 big dogs, shaggy, ugly-looking brutes, were snuffling about in the rubbish. One suddenly glanced up, its eyes gleaming. Mr. Rosethorn froze. A stream of frothy drool was running from the animal's mouth. The author took a cautious step away, and the dog's ears pricked up. Now the other 2 had seen him as well. All 3's attention was suddenly fixed on him. He took another step, and one gave a loud, hungry whimper. The author swallowed hard. This surely couldn't be happening. These things looked feral, and they were more like wolves than dogs. He'd once heard that the thing to do with a dangerous dog was not to show fear, so he began to walk away in a casual fashion, though the urge to run was overwhelming. He managed to avoid it for the next 40 yards until a yowl of anger rose up behind him, and the frantic skittering of paws came racing over the road. Mr. Rosethorn took to his heels with a shriek. He hadn't run anywhere for maybe 20 years, but he ran as hard as he ever had now, hurtling recklessly along the next intersection. Within seconds, though, his 50-year-old heart was pounding painfully in his soft, flabby frame. Gasping for breath, he risked one look over his shoulder and saw the dogs almost upon him, snarling, eyes burning, fangs bared, long red tongues billowing back in the wind. The pack leader howled again, foam spurting from its jaws. That gave the man extra strength, and he charged across the next street before cutting sideways down an underpass. A moment later, he was staggering blindly through a network of subways, lit only by dim bulbs, many of them broken. Desperately, he turned right, then left, at every new set of crossroads. By some fluke, it seemed to work, for the chorus of snarls and yelps fell gradually behind him. He stumbled on for several minutes, however, dripping with icy sweat, before he could bring himself to stop. When he did, he held his breath for a second, to listen, then doubled over, coughing. Eventually, he looked up and brushed his sodden hair back. A glance at his watch showed him that it was now 8:10. Not that he was concerned about dinner anymore. Now all he wanted to do was get out of the hellish place. He listened again. Only silence came back to him. Silence interspersed by drips of water. For the first time, Mr. Rosethorn noticed his surroundings properly. The tunnel was dank, strewn with litter and filled with deep shadows. Then he noticed the graffiti on the wall facing him. It was done out in blood-red spray paint, and read, "No rush. They can't start the hanging without you." The author looked grimly at it for a moment, and briefly some of his old spirit returned. Hanging, eh? He'd see about that. There might well be some hangings after this. He did what he could with himself, though his tuxedo was now damp and his patent shoes scuffed and scratched. A few minutes later, he ascended a ramp and was back in the night air. He still had no idea where he was, of course. Again, he was blocked in by towering buildings. Then he heard somebody singing. He moved eagerly to the corner and peeped round. The singing became clearer. Whoever the chorister was, he was badly out of tune, and also very drunk. Glass suddenly smashed. Mr. Rosethorn jumped. That was when he saw the man advancing slowly along the street towards him, a man staggering in near paralytic fashion. The author felt his hair prickle. The drunk was tall, maybe 6'7", and of Herculean build. What was more, with every parked car he came to, he would lash out a heavy boot and smash off its wing mirror. He was still singing wildly in a thickly slurred voice, but the closer he drew, the more distinct the words. It was something about revenge. Mr. Rosethorn backed around the corner, in the throes of a new panic attack. Fresh sweat broke out on his forehead. His tired heart began again to bang on his ribs. There was another explosion of glass and metal, this one quite close, and the author lurched away, walking as quickly as his weary legs would take him. Almost immediately, though, he was saved. For the first building he came to was the Ingley Wells police station. Again, it was a massive concrete edifice, but there was an open door on its first corner with a blue lamp over it. Thanking God, he stumbled inside. And couldn't get past the internal door. It seemed to be held fast. With a cry of anguish, he began to hammer on its glass panel. The singing man sounded closer. The author knocked again as loudly as he could. Still there was no response. Through the glass, he could see the reception area and front desk. Both were empty and unmanned. Then he realized his mistake. It was locked for a security measure. Right beside him there was an electronic buzzer. Laughing hysterically, he pressed the button. Still nobody appeared. Mr. Rosethorn began to panic. He slammed his hand on the buzzer repeatedly. Still no one came. Then he made an incredible discovery. As he thrust his face up against the panel and peered into the building, he noticed that behind the desk there was a glass partition, and beyond that a small office. In that office he could clearly see the back of somebody's head. They were sitting in front of a portable TV, and they were watching a football match. He rammed the button home again and again, but it brought no response from them. The drunk was now only yards away, his bass chords ringing in Mr. Rosethorn's ears. With a final screech of despair, the author tore himself away, dashed outside, and without even glancing at the lowering shadow of the man, ran for his life down the side of the building. Again, he regretted it, for it led him into a car park with apparently only one avenue of escape, a narrow red-brick passage with a single street light at its far end. It was easily the most sinister place he had yet seen, and for a second he halted. Then the terrible voice came warbling up from behind. Dear God, the bastard was still following him. Mr. Rosethorn hared across the car park, straight down the alley. When he came to the light, he found himself at a T-junction. Two similarly loathsome passages running away in opposite directions, and these into total darkness. He froze, deliberating. Somewhere behind him he could hear the drunk smashing more glass. The author took the left path first, and yards later came up against a brick wall. Frantically he dashed back, passing the light again, and went right. This route plunged on, and soon he was fighting his way through pitch blackness, constantly slipping and tripping in quagmires of mud and trash. The place reeked of mildew, and water was dripping everywhere. He stopped once and looked warily behind him, only to see a huge figure lumbering about under the street lamp, like the Frankenstein monster. That spurred him on violently, so he was doubly dismayed when he came to another dead end. For seconds of sheer terror, he pounded and scrabbled in the dark. There had to be a reason for this alley to exist. There was, and he found it. A door in the left-hand wall. He crashed into it, and it opened. On an even fouler blackness. Mr. Rosethorn didn't care. He stumbled inside. The next thing he knew, he was climbing a steep, narrow stair, tripping over loose boards. He finally reached the top, his fingers scraping on the wet and peeling walls. Then below, the door crashed open again. He heard the raucous singing. It echoed up the stairwell. Unable to believe it, the author backed away. Several feet later, he came to another door. He turned and put his shoulder hard against it. It swung open easily, and then he was struggling through musty drapes. He dragged them aside and was suddenly blinded by light. The torn, dusty, sweat-soaked figure that was Mervyn Rosethorn was standing on a rich pile carpet, looking through his fingers at an ornate chamber. A log fire roared in the hearth beside a well-stocked drinks cabinet. On the other side of the room, several portly gentlemen in evening dress were seated behind a dining table, cutlery and napkins smartly laid out in front of them. It was the mayor's chamber in the town hall, and standing at the table, a glass of sherry in his hand, an empty place beside him, was the mayor himself. He was a jovial, red-cheeked fellow, slightly balding, but with ginger tufts behind each ear. The firelight gleamed on his chain of office. "Well, Mr. Rosethorn," he boomed, "you're a little late, but we waited." The author could only stutter incredulously. The door suddenly opened behind him, and he jumped, but a young woman came in. She was pretty, with long dark hair, and dressed in a stylish jacket and skirt. "It's all right, Mr. Rosethorn," said the mayor. "Only Janice, my secretary, our main organizer." "Good evening, Mr. Rosethorn," she said quietly. He recognized her voice from the telephone. Then he heard a familiar, guttural, pig-like chuckle. He looked round sharply and saw that it came from one of the town's aldermen. He was an obese man with a lank mass of grey hair, and was seated at one end of the table, chuckling away at some private joke. We may only be a small community here, Mr. Rosethorn, the mayor said, as if by way of explanation, but we're very close. We feel things like a family does. So when we lost outside investment after the publication of that book of yours, we all felt it. Do you know over 10 companies have changed their minds about relocating here since you wrote those things about us? His smile began to fade. Companies who would have brought jobs and money. You see, Mr. Rosethorn, we've only been here 30 years, and we've already got a bad unemployment crisis. You saying how awful we were and all that, well, it didn't help much. It took a second for the words to sink in, but when they did, the author virtually exploded. You bloody madman, he roared. I'll sue you all for this. The city fathers laughed, the mayor with them. What, because you ran out of petrol? Because you got lost and flustered and were late for dinner? The author waved the logic aside. Here was flesh and blood, an enemy he could deal with. You small-town punks, he spat. I've got friends in places you wouldn't imagine. I'll sue you for every penny you've got. And he stormed out through the main door, scrambling down the grand stairway to the front lobby. Outside, life on the main thoroughfare seemed normal again. Vehicles were moving back and forth, couples strolling. He hailed a car from the nearby taxi rank and ordered the driver to take him out of town. It was a long trek, but he'd pay the double fare, just to get him out of Ingley Wells. Up in the mayor's parlour, the first course was in progress by the time Janice sat down in the author's place. "Everything all right?" the mayor asked her over his prawn cocktail. She nodded. "Old Charlie Moss picked him up. I asked him earlier, and he was glad to oblige. He and his sons have been out of work since the petrol station had to close. They lose the lease to it next week, poor men. Not to worry, though. They'll still give Mr. Rosethorn a nice, warm reception."
The Hostel by Paul Finch. Read by Dennis Waterman.
Gary knew that he was close. It was an October afternoon when he came down from Grisdale Forest in backpack and boots, and the sun was a fiery scimitar in ash-dark clouds. The cold moorland went red as blood beneath it, and the skeletal trees threw out shadows like long black hands. Silence hung heavy on the high Lakeland ridges. Then he saw it. The hostel. Standing alone in a desolate valley. A gloomy edifice of grey wattle and old timber beams, with a sagging roof of moss-eaten slates. It was a thing of rural grandeur, now long faded. Light shone out through the mullioned windows, and the lawns and hedges were neatly cropped, but the gargoyles on the gateposts were green with moss, and the wooden board showing the name of the place long crabbed over with fungus, as though the owners no longer cared, which Gary suspected they didn't. He was greeted at the back door by a handsome grey-haired lady in a flowered dress. She led him along a passage. All the hikers came in this way, so the carpet was threadbare, the skirting board scuffed, and into a side office where he signed the register. He was only staying a couple of days, he told her. The lady offered him her hand and said she was Mrs. Elwell, the proprietor. The bunks were on the first floor, and he could reach them by the back stairs. He could take his pick. There was nobody else staying at the moment. Breakfast was at 8 sharp. She'd appreciate it if he didn't wear his boots in the dining room. When Gary came out of the office, he noticed 2 doors at the end of the corridor. One was open and led off to the side. He supposed to the dining room. The other was at the far end and was firmly closed, though light shone out through its panel of stained glass. The legend, "Private," was emblazoned across it in gold letters. No doubt it led to the family quarters. Gary glanced at it once, but then looked back sharply. Beyond the stained glass he could clearly make out the shape of a huge man gazing through at him. After a second, the figure receded from view. Gary felt vaguely uneasy. Whoever that man was, he must have been massive. 6'3" at least, with shoulders like a lumberjack's. Then Mrs. Elwell appeared beside him with a pile of fresh bed linen under her arm. She smiled and led the way to the back stairs. It was a smile etched in wood, Gary realised, hard-edged and rather cold. A smile he felt she could drop like the proverbial stone. The back stairs were bare and, judging by the dirt and grass on them, well trodden by hikers. At the top there were 6 small rooms, each one containing 4 bunk beds and a narrow wardrobe with a mirror and a wash basin in it. High letterbox-style windows gave glorious views over distant Coniston Water. As Mrs. Elwell had said, there was nobody else staying, so Gary felt free to pick whichever room he wanted. Not that it made any difference. They were all the same. He took the first and selected an upper bunk. Mrs. Elwell nodded, climbed the ladder and began to make up the bed. Gary watched carefully. He'd chosen upper rather than lower because he'd assumed it would restrict the chances of attack while he was asleep. 10 minutes later, he was alone. He listened for a moment, counting the taps of her heels on the wooden stairs as she descended. Then he unslung his backpack and went through it. Aside from his change of clothes, he'd brought pens and a pad of paper, a small 2-way radio, his handcuffs, and a Colt Cobra revolver. The gun was loaded, but it was fastened into its leather case. His cash and warrant card he kept safely zipped up in the money belt around his waist. It wasn't common to carry ID on a deep cover job like this, but it might just be useful if at some stage he had to prove that he was a member of the Northwest Regional Crime Squad. He closed the door to the room and lifted the 2-way to his lips. "Sadler to 3, he said quietly. A second later, the crackling voice of Detective Inspector Peters came over the air. "Receiving, Gary. Go ahead. Over." "Yeah, boss, I'm in. Everything seems pretty normal. No other guests, though. Place is a bloody mausoleum. Mrs. Elwell doesn't suspect anything, or don't think. Over." There was a pensive silence. Then the DI's voice came back. "Just keep your eyes open, Gary. Over." "Roger, boss. Thanks for that. Over and out." He hid the radio in his bag again and sat on the nearest bunk, thinking. After a second, he took the cobra out and slid it under his pillow. 6 missing persons could not be taken lightly. Of course, this whole operation might turn up nothing, but nearly all the hitchhikers concerned were known to have visited this particular hostel shortly before they dropped out of sight. Coincidence? Gary Sadler thought not for one. Mind, that Mrs. Elwell hadn't seen the type. A bit superior, perhaps, but basically your regular landlady. Then he thought about the figure behind the stained glass, and almost as if on cue there was a loud creak of timbers from the stairwell. Then another, and another. Gary listened. Heavy feet were coming stealthily up the stairs. He felt his hair prickle and glanced at the pillow. A second later, the feet were treading along the landing. The floorway squeaked with each step. He pictured feet of elephantine proportions. They approached his room with agonizing slowness. Gary watched the closed door expectantly, drops of sweat gathering in one eyebrow. They reached it. Then they paused. But only for a second. A moment later, they had passed. Then he heard the creaked click of a door being opened and closed, and the feet returning, padding ponderously past and back down the stairs again. Gary waited for a second or two, then stuck his head out onto the landing. It was wood-panelled, and with the sun now setting, very gloomy. He listened intently. The colossal feet had withdrawn into the depths of the hostel. Then a door creaked open behind him. Gary whirled around, only to find that halfway along the passage a cupboard had not been closed properly. He walked up to it and found it stacked with freshly laundered blankets. He could have kicked himself and retreated quickly into his room, closing the door again and writing up his notes. When he had finished, he dated the page, timed it and signed it, then folded it and stored it in a plastic wallet in his backpack. By the time he had finished, the sun was a glowing ribbon on the distant fells, and the blue-black mist of the autumn filtering slowly into the house. He switched the light on, then, as an afterthought, checked the windows. They'd been nailed shut. Gary kneeled on the top bunk and gazed at the rows of nail heads, painted over in white emulsion but running in unbroken lines under the various panes of glass. He was totally boxed in. It was a regular man-trap. He changed into white plimsolls and a T-shirt, then thought about his next move. After a second, he made his way downstairs. The corridor leading in from the back door was deserted. He walked along it until he came to the office. Again, it was empty. On the desk inside, however, he saw the register lying open. Quickly, he leafed through the pages. As he'd expected, the names of all 6 missing persons corresponded with signatures in the book over the last few weeks. He stepped back into the corridor. At the far end, the door with the stained glass panel seemed to beckon to him. He stole up to it, straining his eyes to penetrate the blocks of colour. Nothing moved beyond it. He tried the handle, and to his surprise, it moved. The door was not locked and opened smoothly. On the other side lay a neat hallway with a thick piled carpet, tasteful wallpaper, and various items of furniture, either brass or teak, all gleaming with polish. Somewhere above, a clock ticked loudly. Gary ventured in. Various doors led off into rooms, and he glanced into each one as he passed. The first was a small parlour, complete with armchairs and a bookcase. The next a dining room with places laid for 2. The third was more interesting. He went warily in. A sofa and armchairs were arranged round a huge hearth. Cabinets surrounded the room, and solemn oil paintings hung on the walls. 2 particular things caught Gary's attention, however. A photo portrait in a frame at one end of the mantelpiece, and at the other, also framed, a military regimental citation. He looked at both. The photo showed a laughing teenage boy dressed in T-shirt and jeans. There was no name with it. The citation seemed to refer to somebody else. It commemorated one George Reginald Elwell for being a distinguished member of the Special Air Service, 1963 to 1989. He'd apparently retired at the rank of major. Gary was impressed. He'd contemplated the army himself before finally opting for the police, and he knew what it meant to serve in the SAS. He turned to leave, and found his way barred by a huge man standing arms folded in the doorway. Gary stopped in his tracks. The man was middle-aged, but of solid build, and stood at least 6'4" tall. He was dressed casually but smartly in slippers, neatly creased trousers, and a white shirt buttoned at the collar. He had cool blue eyes, a trim moustache, and greying hair cut very short, which revealed a bull neck and leathery sunburnt skin. Instantly, Gary realised that he was looking at Major George Elwell, retired. "Lost, are we?" the man wondered in a quiet voice. Gary hastened to explain in his best average guy kind of voice. Sorry, mate, truly am. I was well, not knowing the district like, I was wondering if either yourself or your missus could give me directions to the nearest boozer." The Major's expression never changed. Like his wife's, his face was etched in wood. "Drink, is it?" Gary nodded. "That's right, yeah." He was doing his level best not to sound too nervous. The old soldier came slowly into the room and closed the door behind him. "No need for that," he said, bending down, opening a cupboard and taking out a bottle and 2 tumblers. Gary went cold as he watched the man place the glasses on the sideboard, unscrew the bottle, which was unlabelled, and pour out 2 generous measures. "Whiskey?" the Major asked. Gary's mouth was too dry to form an answer. The Major looked round at him, his eyes hard like pebbles. The young copper felt his skin creeping. He gazed down at the drink as it was offered to him. The liquid was almost clear, that spicy scent of whiskey noticeably absent. He took the glass all the same. The old soldier picked up his and lifted it to his lips. He didn't drink, however, but simply watched Gary over the rim. The detective felt his heart thumping. He looked down at the drink again, then over at the unmarked bottle. What in the name of Christ was it? He could sense the Major's eyes boring into him. The Major, who was several inches taller than he was, several stones heavier, who was a trained killer, who was also, by the looks of him, completely round the twist. Holding his breath, Gary took a sip, prepared to hold it in his mouth and spit it out the moment he tasted anything odd. To his surprise, however, a fine malt, smokily textured and deliciously sweet, spilled across his tongue. He glanced up at the Major, who had by now taken a generous swallow from his own glass. Gary could hardly contain his relief. He nodded towards the citation. "Former SAS man, I see. Cool, I bet you've seen a bit in your time." The man said nothing but stared at the wall as though seeing something else, his brow furrowed. Gary tried to laugh. He looked round at the picture of the teenager. "That your boy, then?" "Did have a boy," said the old soldier at length. He reached out for the whiskey bottle. "More?" Gary had no chance to reply, for the door suddenly opened and Mrs. Elwell stepped in. She was wearing garden gloves and carrying a pair of rose clippers, but when she saw what was going on, she flew into a rage. "George!" she almost shouted. The big man edged slowly away from her, his mouth set hard like a trap. The woman laid her clippers to one side, then took Gary by the arm and literally steered him out of the room and down the hall. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sadler. We don't allow guests into our home." They passed through the stained glass door and continued along the corridor toward the back stairs, Gary apologising all the way. Still the woman kept a grip on his elbow. She only released him when they came to the bottom of the stairs. It suddenly struck him how tired and drawn she looked. She had a full head of grey hair, but couldn't have been much older than 45. "It's not your fault, I suppose," she said after a moment. "It's George. I'm afraid he never really recovered after we lost Nigel. He was our son." Gary glanced back along the passage. "The young lad in the picture?" She nodded. "He went off to college, you see. Fell into bad habits. Only one casualty among many in this day and age, I suppose. No consolation to us, of course." "I'm sorry," said Gary. She tried to smile, but tears sparkled in her eyes. "It's hardly your place to be sorry, Mr. Sadler. It's not your fault, but, well, George broods rather a lot. He hasn't had much time for young people. He blames them absolutely for what happened to Nigel. Their permissive, irresponsible influence, he calls it." She tried to smile again but failed and moved wearily away. Gary spent the whole night on his guard, lying on the bunk fully clothed, sitting up gun in hand at the slightest sound. He'd made more notes before turning the light out. In his own mind, at least, he was convinced that he was in the house of a lunatic. Without exception, the missing persons in question were young people, to use Mrs. Elwell's terminology. It already seemed cut and dried what had happened to them. Not that he had anything like enough evidence yet. The first thing he needed to do in the morning was find a telephone and report properly to the squad. The radio was only for quick messages. Several times that night he fancied he'd heard someone padding quietly about the house. He was sure he'd notice if those huge feet came up the stairs again. But didn't the SAS train their men to move like cats? In one instance, he imagined he could hear the floorboards creaking outside the door, as if someone was standing there listening. He certainly heard the odd muffled thump, like doors being opened and closed somewhere else in the building. And at no time during those midnight hours did he see light, either shining under his door or up through the window from other rooms. Whatever was going on in the hostel was going on in the dark. By breakfast time, of course, he had fallen asleep. It was nearly 10 o'clock before he opened his eyes, and when he looked at his watch, he cursed himself. He got up quickly and went to the top of the stairs. No sound came up from below, but there was a faint smell of bacon and toast. He pulled his plimsolls on and crept downstairs. He found the office empty, but to his surprise there was no telephone in there, or anywhere near it, not even a payphone. For a second he considered his options. At some stage he would have to kit out and get up on the fells, just to keep up the appearances of normality. But he needed to ring in first. As far as he knew, the nearest village was 6 or 7 miles away. Quite a hike with nothing solid to report apart from a weird encounter over a drinks cabinet. Gary realised that he needed more evidence, and that evidence he was sure still lay behind the stained glass door. Anything he found now would be inadmissible, of course, but it would give him a good reason to turn the place over legally. A moment later he was peeping back into the Elwells' living quarters. The first thing he saw was the lady herself leaving the building via the front door, again armed with gloves and rose clippers. That was a start, he thought, stepping in. As before, silence hung in the stately rooms. He crept along the hall and came to the bottom of a grand staircase, glancing warily up it. Then there was a terrible rustle of paper behind him. Gary turned sharply and found himself looking directly across the hall into the lounge. George Elwell was sitting in the facing armchair reading the Times. For a second the young cop was rooted to the spot. Clearly the man hadn't yet seen him, but it could only be a matter of moments. Without another thought, the detective darted up the stairs. He waited at the top for a minute or so, then turned. Again he was confronted by various rooms. He checked them quickly. They were bedrooms, all nicely furnished and made up. In one, presumably the Elwell's own, there was a large four-poster. Gary noticed a suit of khaki combat fatigues lying on top of it. They were dirty and well-worn. He stared at them for a moment, then went quickly on to the next room. Pulling the door open, he found himself gazing into an old closet and was suddenly embraced by a rank odour of dirt and sweat. He looked down and saw a heap of clothes stuffed under the bottom shelf. There were hiking boots amongst them, of various sizes. Cagoules as well, socks, sweaters, underwear, all twisted together, filthy and heavily stained by some reddish-brown fluid which Gary knew only too well. He closed the door and backed across the landing, his mind racing. Then he heard somebody coming up the stairs. In a wild panic, he dashed into the first room he could find and closed the door behind him. He pressed his ear to the wood and listened, but heard nothing. Eventually he looked around. He was in what appeared to be a teenager's room. Action movie posters adorned the walls, airfix models of planes hung from the ceiling. Comics were stacked under a bedside table with a small old-fashioned record player and a pair of earphones on top of them. Across the room there was a writing desk with a portable TV on top. Above that, 3 shelves were loaded down with paperbacks. Gary moved into the middle of it, bewildered. "It's my son's room," said a soft voice behind him. He turned slowly. Mrs. Elwell stood in the doorway. Again her eyes were glazed with tears of barren longing. He knew that she wasn't really seeing him. "I keep it just the way he left it when he first went off to college," she said. A tear ran down her cheek and she smiled fondly. "He visits us most nights, you see. Most nights. I keep his room like this in case he decides to stay with us again. One can always hope." She continued to stare into space, and Gary sidled quickly past her. The landing was deserted, but through the door to the Elwell's bedroom he saw that the combat fatigues had been removed from the bed. That chilled him, and he hurried downstairs. There was now no sign of George Elwell in the lounge, but his copy of the Times was lying on the armchair. It was open at the cartoon section. Gary began to run, charging down the passage to the back stairs, then up them to his room. Fleetingly he wondered if he'd find anyone waiting up there, but knew that he had to recover his equipment. The room was as he'd left it, however, and he threw his gear together in record time, hoisting the pack onto his back. At any second he expected to hear the tread of gigantic feet on the stairs, trapping him in his cul-de-sac with his nailed-up windows. He had the Colt Cobra, of course, and he took it out and tucked it into his belt, pulling his sweater down over it. He had no hesitation in leaving the building without paying. There was nobody there to pay anyway. He dashed outside, finding the air fresh and earthy with the scent of autumn. Invigorated by it, he struck off quickly down the drive towards the gate, not once looking back. In the corner of his eye, though, he fancied a tall, camouflaged figure was watching from the undergrowth. He quickened his pace, wishing that he hadn't left the radio buried in his backpack. It was 6 miles to civilization after all. Once out on the lane, he turned north. The Furness Fells loomed in the valley ahead, their craggy brows buried in dull grey cloud. The foliage was dead and brown, but massed thickly on either side of him as he went. Many shady avenues ran off into the woods. The morning seemed incredibly quiet. It was the off-season, of course, and Gary realised it was possible he'd travel the whole distance to Hawkshead without meeting anyone at all. There was only one thing for it. He'd have to stop and get the radio out. Just then he heard a crack in the trees behind him. He hurried on, now fighting the urge to run. They couldn't really afford to let him live, of course. Not after what he'd seen. In growing panic, he darted off the road, scrambled down a steep slope through drifts of leaves. Somewhere behind him, he imagined a loud thrashing of branches. Then he slipped and fell, rolling heavily, barking his knees and elbows. He felt the cobra vanish from his waistband. He swore aloud, but had no intention of going back for it. Then he regained his feet. He ran, ducking low branches, vaulting over rocks and fallen trees. The Cumbrian woodland seemed suddenly primordial. So dark and tangled was it. He fought his way through it regardless, never once looking back, but always hearing the distant crash of undergrowth. And then, all of a sudden, he came out onto a road. Gary stopped for a moment. It was a single-track tarmac lane. Breathless, he started along it. More branches snapped. He was about to break into another run when he heard the distant sound of an engine. He came to a halt and looked behind him, wide-eyed. The trees were packed with shadows, but nothing moved in them. The engine was nearer now. The detective waited, unsure which way the vehicle was coming from. Then he heard a click. Twig snapping, hammer on revolver. He ran out into the road, turning round and round. Still he saw no one, and then a ramshackle van came clattering round the corner, screeching to a halt when its driver saw Gary. He hurried towards it, yanking open the passenger door. "Quick!" he shouted hoarsely. "Get me out of here, now!" At first the driver made no move. He was a hippie type with a goatee beard and his hair in long, greasy dreadlocks. He wore beads and an old denim jacket, literally coated in oil and dirt. He was fairly grimy himself, and his cabin reeked of ganja. Gothic tattoos were visible on his chest. "What's up, mate?" he asked. "I'm in trouble. Please, you've got to get me to a phone," Gary stammered, throwing his pack in and climbing after it. "I can pay." The driver nodded, and with what seemed like painful slowness, started the engine up again. "Better buckle yourself in. Don't want to get stopped by the pigs." Gary nodded and complied. Now sweating hard, he craned his neck round. Through the filthy rear windows, the narrow lane was still deserted. "So," said the driver after a second. "How is he, the old fella? Still refuses to acknowledge I'm alive?" It took a moment for Gary to realise what the man had said. He looked slowly round. The driver chuckled, showing nicotine-yellow teeth. "Be interesting to see how long he can hold out now. The coppers are going to come round sooner or later. God knows I've left enough evidence round the place for 'em." He looked at Gary again, and now the resemblance to the photograph was clear, even after wasted years of drugs and booze. The detective grabbed at the seatbelt catch, but found it jammed, or rather locked. Whichever, it held fast. He reached for the gun, but of course it had gone. The driver was now laughing raucously. He swung the van round a corner and down an even narrower lane, one densely overhung with branches. "Relax, pal," he said. "It's him I've got the beef with, not you. I'll make it quick." He opened the glove compartment, and daylight waxed on the blade of a butcher's knife. "I always do."
By Stella Whitelaw, read by Kate O'Mara.
She tried sitting on every sofa in the room like Goldilocks. The posh beige velvet was on casters and moved. The big striped four-seater had a cheerless view. The shouting pink was as soft as a marshmallow. The tiny cushions precocious and no real support for aches. It was necessary to find the right seat, even though she was not staying long. She was a woman in transit. She chose the bluey green. Old and lumpy, but it matched her trousers, and she merged into it the same way that she blended into everything in life. "I'm just a merger," she said to the red walls, cradling the empty coffee cup in her cold hands. The residue of heat made a token gesture of comfort. "I'll never be anyone in my own right. Not now." Cocks crowing in the distance disturbed the quietness. They didn't know dawn had long vanished into the drizzle of the morning. She shivered, the insistent beating of her heart louder than her breathing. Someone would be coming soon, she felt sure. It was too long to be alone. There was nothing in the red room that faintly resembled the silver object. She was glad about that. She did not want to think about the silver object, or touch it, or ever see it again. They could put it in a museum. Perhaps the Black Museum at Scotland Yard would house it along with other gruesome relics. The red walls enclosed around her like loving arms, full of forgiveness, but without suffocating her. It was a big room, sighing with air to breathe and 2 doors to escape through if she wanted to escape, to dance on the hills. She was not sure if she wanted to escape now. The silver object had been Harry's. It was one of those mysterious components of his life that quite evaded Layla's comprehension. She made a point of passing remarks on his work, on his sporting activities, on the various committees he supported. "How did the committee meeting go?" she'd ask. "Splendid. Decent chaps. Progress." "Did they decide anything?" The silver object was a seafaring projectile of some sort, winged, polished, heavy with smooth, clean lines. Harry was very proud of it. It had been a prize for his work on some project. Layla had not been there when he received the prize. She had been in Northampton Hospital, strapped and pulverised into a breech berth, brain clouded crimson. She heard later that Harry made a 20-minute acceptance speech. He could talk when he wanted to, but not to her. Young Hal came bottom first. It personified his whole existence. Layla said laughingly that he even thought bottom first. He grew into a thin, amiable lad with a wide grin. His mother's joy, his father's embarrassment. There certainly wasn't going to be a place for young Hal in his father's firm of accountants. Harry hadn't got where he was today by throwing paper darts and pressing daisies. Layla sat in the red room thinking about young Hal. It wasn't his fault he was slow or lacked his father's brilliant mind. Young Hal liked other things: flowers, animals, walking. He would make a good gardener. Harry, of course, blamed her viciously. It was her diet, her smoking, her glasses of wine, Bulgarian red, the physical needs of her heavy body when she should have been content to knit small garments. He raged at her in monosyllables. She longed to unpick time and set the alarm earlier. No thought, no care, no responsibility, child in your womb. But Harry, a breach isn't affected by smoking. Disgusting. Habit. She had known, years before young Hal's arrival, that Harry understood nothing and did not know that he did not understand. The stupidity lay within her. She was as stupid as those jet-lagged crowing cocks. But she had no parents to blame, no unemployment, no redundancy. The blame lay totally in herself. She had been adolescently blind, control sliding, burning herself in wanton thoughts of desire. She had not even noticed the one door of escape. It was nowhere near Christmas when Harry came home from a Rotary Club meeting, drenched in whiskey and Rive Gauche. He wore the kind of silly smirk that told Layla he had been handling a pair of page 3s. "Have you had a good meeting?" she asked. "You bet. Splendid chaps. Decent grub. Bed now." She felt brushed off, like a crumb from his sleeve. Her despair picked itself up from the floor. "Is that all you've got to say?" she said, voice low. "I suppose it means nothing that I've been alone all day, all evening. Don't I even merit a whole sentence? Do you think you could manage to talk to me, just for once? Add a few verbs, perhaps?" Harry looked at her open-mouthed, fumed with stale green breath. "Heavens, woman! Rubbish! Time on your hands! Not enough to do!" "Not enough to do? With young Hal to look after? I don't think you've any idea of the amount of care he needs. You ought to take my place for a change. You wouldn't last 10 minutes. "Bloody woman! Always nagging!" he roared, fuzzed with alcohol as he picked up the silver projectile. He lunged at her, and her arms flew upwards to protect herself. She wrenched the winged cylinder out of his hand and threw it at his staggering figure with all her strength. In the same split second, she saw her sleepy son standing in the doorway. But it was already too late. There was no rewind for this scene. "Mummy?" gasped young Hal, wide-eyed. "Mummy?" the second door to the Red Room opened and the nurse came out. She smiled pleasantly at Layla and beckoned her over. "Dr. Harris will see you now," she said. Layla got up awkwardly. She felt stiff and tired. It had been nice to sit quietly in the Red Room, but seeing the psychiatrist wasn't doing any good. He said she would get over it. But she wouldn't. Ever. If only young Hal had not come downstairs. If only Harry had not ducked.
The Lettuce Field by Robert Eastland. Read by Ross Kemp.
When Mark rang Laura at her office that morning, he was babbling again. She listened as patiently as she could, then asked Mark why he wasn't at work. After a moment, he told her that he'd booked a couple of days off to try and catch him. The man from the lettuce field. He'd taken 2 whole days off to catch him. He'd only lain in bed until 9:30, but already the interloper had been in, made himself a cup of tea, watched the breakfast news. He'd even left the back door open and spread the Daily Mail out on the kitchen table. At least, that was the state Mark found things in when he finally come downstairs. Laura told him to calm down, but his mood quickly changed from fearful disbelief to self-righteous anger. It was all right for her with her swish-padding barking and loads of people living around her all day. How would she like it, though, to find that whenever she wasn't in, somebody else was living in her house? And then he slammed the phone down. She gazed blankly at her PC for a moment, hot-faced and tight-lipped, before carefully dialing his number and waiting for him to answer. He did, within 3 seconds. What did she want now? He wondered sulkily. She was strongly tempted to shout and swear at him, to tell him to get it together or kiss her cute ass goodbye, and probably his job as well. She didn't know for sure, but Laura couldn't see how this jittery, chain-smoking, nervous wreck of a man could be handling all those multi-million-pound deals which once literally flowed from his fingertips. "Today's Thursday," she said, "which means I can't come up to the cottage just yet. I'll be up tomorrow night, though. First thing. We'll have a nice, quiet weekend together, and we can discuss this." She could hardly bring herself to say it, but for his sake, she managed it. This man in the lettuce field. When he had hung up, Laura sat back in her swivel chair and gazed out through the glass partition walls into the bustling high-tech commercial world she was so crucially a part of. As was Mark, of course, though he was normally based on the other side of Threadneedle Street. His new cottage out in the Essex countryside was admittedly a world away from all this, but she'd never expected it to have this effect on him. Mark spent the rest of the day on his guard. Holbrook Cottage was a big thatched 17th century affair, with wide lawns on 3 sides of it, and an old farmyard still strewn with quaint bits of machinery at the back. It occupied 4 acres altogether, which was a lot of ground to keep an eye on your own, especially when you were expecting an intruder, especially when that intruder could access your perimeter at any point he chose. Because apart from the winding lane linking Holbrook Cottage to the B184, it was completely surrounded by lettuce fields, sweeping away into the horizon. They didn't go on indefinitely. From any window in Mark's house he could see the smoke of other country homes or distant tractors on the move. Then there was the pub, which served the whole community, and sat on the corner where Holbrook Lane joined the main road. But it was the proximity of the lettuce fields to Mark's land. He was convinced that the mysterious intruder, when he wasn't making himself at home in the cottage, was hiding out there. What was worse, there were no fences separating the farm from this ocean of malign vegetables. A dry ditch with occasional clumps of hawthorn surrounded the estate, but that was way too little in Mark's opinion. So he had to patrol. That was the only way. Even then, however, he had problems. Armed with a stick, he made rounds of the cottage, but on the very first occasion found the back door open. As always, there was no damage. The intruder clearly had his own key. As always, he had been and gone. The kitchen smelt of toast, however, and there were crumbs and smears of butter on the table. Fresh washing up. A plate and knife now sat in the sink, awaiting Mark's attention. This was nothing, however, compared to what went on during the week. When Mark came home in the evenings, he regularly found evidence that 3-course meals and bottles of his best wine had all been consumed over a period of hours. That videos had been watched and left in the machine. That CDs had been played, books taken down from shelves, even one of his beds slept in. In short, whoever it was clearly had the view that he now shared this house with Mark. How the hell did he always manage to stay out of sight, though? After lunch that day, Mark allowed himself a little nap in front of the television, and when he came round an hour later, found that his post had arrived and been opened and read, and that somebody had even been into his study, accessed his most confidential computer files and made some alterations to the latest deal he was working on. What was more, these had been alterations for the good. They'd cracked the case, in fact. That evening, he strolled up the lane to the pub and wondered idly if any of the locals knew any funny stories about Holbrook Cottage. Nobody did. There were no spooky superstitions about the place. Again, only blank looks and the odd bemused glance from farmer to farmer. Not that he'd ever seriously considered that it might be a ghost. Ghosts didn't empty a whiskey decanter the way this mysterious person did while Mark was out at the pub. He ran round and round the outside of the house after this, cursing and shouting, but only the echoes came back to him from the haze of the summer night as it settled blue and purple on the neatly regimented vistas of the lettuce field. He was out there somewhere. He was out there, Mark thought, as he stood gazing into the distance. One of these days he was going to go kicking his way through that lot and find the bastard. But not now. He was too tired and too drunk now. On Friday evening, Laura went down to the health spa in the basement, worked out, then showered and changed into jeans and sweater and set off for the sticks. Once she got out of London, it wouldn't be a long drive. The moment she hit the quieter country roads, she called Mark on a car phone. He answered in a voice of gloom and despondency. How was everything, she wondered. How did she think? This person was still hanging around the cottage. This person was going to cop it in a big way if Mark ever got his hands on him. He'd been to see the police that day, and they'd sent 2 officers back with him, including a fingerprints man. But as there was no evidence of burglary or even damage to the property, there was apparently nothing they could do. Laura arrived at the cottage later that evening, and they sat drinking port and eating Stilton in the beautifully restored oldie-worldy lounge. She couldn't help notice how untidy the place was, and how Mark, normally so fastidious, had degenerated. He hadn't shaved or even combed his hair in several days, was clad in slippers and a scruffy tracksuit and smelled vaguely of stale sweat. It didn't stop her making love to him afterwards, in his 4-poster bed, but throughout seemed distracted, constantly getting up to look out through the window or glance onto the landing. He seemed convinced that somebody would be there, but from her arrival Laura had seen no indication of that at all. Later on, however, he showed her something which was hard to explain. The tyres on his Porsche were scorched and blistered almost down to the ply-cord. It was flat out of petrol. Its engine still reeked of the serious revving it had received recently. Some costly repair work was now needed. More to the point, however, Mark hadn't been out in it since first thing in the morning. Still more baffling, nobody had broken into the car, and it hadn't been hot-wired, yet the only keys had been in Mark's pocket all the time. At no stage had he even been aware that the car was missing. Laura had gone up to Holbrook Cottage to dispute her fiancé's theories, but now she felt distinctly unnerved herself. "What makes you think he's hiding out in the lettuce field?" she asked, as they tidied the kitchen. "It stands to reason," he said, "unless he's Billy Whizz, I mean. I can see for miles in every direction, but those bloody lettuces, well, they're knee-deep at this time of year, aren't they? And before you ask, yes, I have searched the house. There's nowhere he could be hiding in here. In any case, whoever this person is, He always has to come into the building to work his mischief. And he does, believe you me. Do you know the bastard comes in to make himself cups of tea all the time now? All the bloody time. I only have to look the other way. All Saturday they hung round the house, waiting for some sign of the intruder. The afternoon was hot, and they spent it reclined on the lawn, on loungers, pretending to be asleep, clad only in shorts and T-shirts, and empty bottles of Chablis between them. Crickets chittered in the grass, a distant jet thundered in the azure sky, but nobody came to the cottage. "He must be watching us from the lettuce field," Mark said that night. "That's the only explanation. He knows you're here and doesn't want to chance it." Laura wasn't quite so convinced. The lettuce field, indeed. It seemed so ridiculous. And why would somebody want to be living here on the quiet? The following morning was equally sunny, and they drove out to Colchester to look at the castle. On their return at tea time, Mark fully expected to find the house wide open and littered with evidence of the intruder. But it was firmly closed and locked, with not an item out of place. As they walked from one downstairs room to the next, he shook his head in bewilderment. Finally, he looked round at her. "Perhaps if you were to stay here from now on, he'd be gone for good." She shook her head. "Oh, no. No. It's not nearly so simple as that, Mark. You know perfectly well you should never have moved this far out in the first place. I told you that at the time. I mean, it's a lovely cottage, but it's too far out for me. I'll stay one more night, but I'm off at 6 prompt, as always." He nodded, then went slowly upstairs, muttering something about wanting to have provided a nice family home for them and how everything had gone wrong. Laura watched him sadly. Suddenly she felt she had to get outside for some fresh air. It was as she stood on the lawn in the fragrant breeze that she noticed the old tractor hauling its way up Holbrook Lane. An inspired thought came to her. It could only have been to the lettuce field. Its driver must be the farmer who owned it, or one of his labourers. Excuse me, she shouted, but the tractor was out of earshot. It was already moving from sight. In a moment it would be on the main road. Laura jumped quickly into a car and drove off after it. Mark moped about upstairs for a few minutes, then glanced out of his study window at the ominous thunderclouds looming in from the west. It had been a hot day, he supposed. He wandered back to the top of the stairs and saw the 2 bags standing packed and ready on the landing. Laura's bags. Mark was astonished. She hadn't packed so quickly, had she? Of course she hadn't. He'd been in after all. The little bastard had been in and dropped a rather large hint about what he thought of Laura. That was too much for Mark. It was finally too much. With a strangled cry of rage, he staggered down the stairs and out of the house, blundering across the lawn into the lettuce field. The sky was now darkening with cloud and a chill wind blowing, but he stormed on, cutting a jagged path through the dense green plants. Minutes seemed to pass as he shouted and swore and kicked at the lettuces, smashing them to a pulp. At last, when nothing happened and nobody came, he looked behind him. He was surprised to see how far he had come from the house. It was miles away. The other side of the lettuce field, even. The little man sat on his tractor in the pub car park and shook his head. He seemed like a nice man, Laura thought, with overalls on and curly red hair under his flat cap. He spoke with a strong local accent. "Ain't never seen no one strange hanging about the lettuces, miss, and I've worked 'em since I was a lad." Laura had guessed as much. She thanked him. "Why are you and that young man of yours so interested in our lettuces, then?" he asked her as she climbed back into her car. "I see him wandering about in them all the time." She looked sharply up at him. "What?" "He always is," the tractor man confirmed. "All week. Dressed up to kill too, in his Sunday best." Laura drove unsteadily from the car park, her breath coming in short gasps. Mark was standing, looking at the figure crouching among the lettuce plants. A dark, indistinct figure it was, a few yards to his left, crouching very low. Crouching because it was trying to hide from him. Mark took a step towards it. He could feel the blood bursting through his veins, his heart hammering his ribs. He took another step. A mad wind rushing in his ears, at long last. And then he saw the figure's face. It staggered him. Then he saw it tense, and that was when he realized it wasn't crouching because it was trying to hide. It was crouching because it was about to spring. It sprang. As she cruised slowly back down Holbrook Lane, Laura consulted a file of facts and called up one of the partners in Mark's firm. It was a close personal friend. He was at home with the family, enjoying a barbecue, he told her cheerily. Laura steadied her voice and asked how Mark was doing. The partner's raucous humour dried up fairly quickly. He couldn't seem to find the words, and he had to stammer that he was sorry. And didn't she know? And he'd always liked Mark and always been grateful for his work. But all these unwarranted absences over the last few months, and it really wasn't on, and in the end, well, they'd had no choice. When? She asked him. He told her. 3 months ago. Mark had never taken such a physical beating. He'd given as good as he could, but the force of the blows to his face and body had been unbearable. It was a miracle he could still walk. If he was walking, he thought as he swayed drunkenly back through the lettuces to the house. The pains in his limbs, his ribs, his jaw, the world seemed to swim around him. He wondered how many bones he'd broken, how long he'd been unconscious. The sky was now leaden grey, deep shadows lying over everything. But he could still see Laura pulling up onto the drive and running to the cottage door. He saw her knocking frantically and talking to somebody inside who clearly wouldn't let her in. Then he noticed that somebody had thrown her bags out. As he got nearer, he could hear her pleading, begging him to let her help him. Another voice came out from the house, ordering her away in the foulest terms. Undeterred, Laura continued to knock, but when somebody drew the curtains close on her, and then the first roll of thunder came in like drums from the west, she turned and grabbed up her bags. Mark just reached the ditch as she stumbled, weeping towards her car. Painfully, he called to her, but she either didn't hear or ignored him. She threw her stuff into the boot, then climbed into the driving seat and surged away up the lane in a cloud of dust. Mark stared after her in disbelief. And then he looked back to the cottage. Lights were visible behind the curtains, and he could hear the television on, but there was now a locked, secure look about the place. He didn't suppose there'd be any easily accessible tea things left out for him. He turned wearily round and began to walk, just as the rain started. It was going to be another wet night in the lettuce field.